There is a certain kind of story that television loves to tell. The kind where a man climbs to the top of the mountain, holds the gold above his head, and lets the crowd carry him into legend. But this is not that story. Or rather, it is that story, hiding a second story underneath it, one that no camera ever caught during those roaring nights under the lights. Picture a heavyweight champion of the world. Broad shoulders, a jab like a piston, trademark pink trunks flashing under the arena glare. On the last day of August in 1984, in Las Vegas, Nevada, Pinklon Thomas won the World Boxing Council Heavyweight Championship, one of the most coveted titles in all of sport. To the public, he was a picture of strength, discipline, and raw physical dominance. But behind that gold belt was a man carrying something no opponent could ever hit him with, a dependency on a forbidden substance, a private battle that had started when he was still a child, long before the world ever learned his name. And here is the part that still stops people cold. Years later, in his own words, Thomas would admit the truth about those championship nights. "I was still using at the time," he said, "that I was fighting all of those guys." Think about what that means. The most brutal one-on-one contest a human being can enter. A sport with no teammate to hide behind, no bench to sit on, nowhere to disappear. And this man was climbing through the ropes while quietly fighting a war inside his own body. So how does that happen? How does a man become champion of the hardest sport on earth while losing a slower, quieter fight nobody could see? To understand how the poison got into the corner, we have to go back, long before the belt, to a young boy in Michigan who made a choice that would haunt every single round of his life. He was born on the 10th of February, 1958, in Pontiac, Michigan. Remember that date. It is not just a birthday. Decades later, it would become the single most important number on his personal calendar, a date he would circle in his own mind and celebrate for reasons that had nothing to do with cake or candles. But that meaning was still far away. In the beginning, there was only a boy and a childhood that never seemed to sit still. Pontiac was a hard industrial town in a hard industrial era, the kind of place built on factory work and factory hours, where the ground could shift beneath a family without warning. And the Thomas family did not stay in one place. His early years carried him across the country, through military bases in South Carolina and in Washington State, before life would eventually lead him to Florida. For a child, that kind of movement leaves a mark. New towns, new faces, the constant packing and unpacking of a life. This was a black childhood in a restless corner of mid-century America, in years when opportunity and instability often lived on the very same street. For a lot of young men in that world, the pressures pushed hard, and the shortcuts that appeared were almost always the dangerous ones. Thomas himself would later frame it plainly. It was, he said, bad decisions that started it all. Not fate, not one single villain. Just choices. The kind a young person makes before they understand how far the consequences will reach. And that is the quiet tragedy sitting at the front of this whole story. Because by the time most children were still figuring out who they wanted to be, Pinklon Thomas had already made a decision that would trap him for the next 2 decades, at just 12 years old. Some doors, once opened, never fully close again. According to his own memoir, a book he would title with brutal honesty, Back from the Edge of Hell. Pinklon Thomas first tried a forbidden substance at the age of 12. 12! An age when a boy should be worrying about nothing heavier than a bicycle or a baseball glove. And by the time he turned 14, that early experiment had become something far darker. He was, by his own account, fully in its grip, years before the world would ever chant his name inside an arena. This was not the familiar tale of a famous man falling from grace. There was no fame yet. There was no fortune to lose. This was a child, already losing himself before boxing ever entered the picture. And it did not stop there. In his memoir, Thomas recounts how, by the age of 15, he had left school behind entirely and was living inside a world of street survival, a world he describes as involving robbery and real, genuine danger. These are his recollections, told in his own book, of a teenage life spent on the edge of catastrophe. It is a heavy thing to imagine. A boy of 15, no classroom, no clear future, already surviving by the harshest rules a young person can know. His memoir presents this stretch as the darkest early chapter of his life, and it is easy to see why. Most stories of downfall come after the mountaintop. His came before he had climbed anything at all. And yet, and this is the strange, almost unbelievable turn, somewhere inside that lost teenager was an athlete, a gifted one, good enough that years later he would claim he could have played professional basketball, football, or baseball. But of all the roads available to a young man of that talent, he chose the loneliest sport of them all. By the time his path carried him to Seattle, Washington, something in Pinklon Thomas was searching for a way out. And what he later recalled about that period is remarkable, though it comes from his own memory, told in his own words. He believed his athletic gifts were wide enough to take him almost anywhere. In his telling, he had the raw ability to chase basketball, football, or baseball, to pursue the kind of team sport career that so many young athletes dream about. There are no league records or team documents to confirm formal offers, and Thomas has always framed this as his own sense of what he could have done. But whether the offers were real or simply the confidence of a young man who knew his own body, the point is the same. He had options. He chose the ring. And his reasoning tells you almost everything about the man. Boxing, he explained, was one-on-one. All you had to do, he said, was have a great big heart, have athletic talent and skill, and to be able to take a shot. Sit with that for a moment. Of all the sports in the world, he was drawn to the one where there is nowhere to hide, no teammate to cover for a bad day, no bench, no timeout, no one else to blame when the punches come. For a man already carrying a private battle, there was something almost haunting in the choice. He picked the sport that would strip him down to nothing but his own heart and his own will. Then came the leap that still makes boxing historians blink. Pinklon Thomas turned professional after just 3 amateur fights. 3. In a sport where most contenders build hundreds of amateur bouts before ever cashing a professional check, this was almost unheard of, a sign of both his enormous natural gift and his impatience to move, to rise, to get somewhere fast. He entered the professional ranks in 1978 with almost no amateur foundation beneath him, and somehow, over the next 6 years, he would climb all the way to a shot at the world title, hiding a secret in plain sight the entire way. Every great fighter needs an identity, something the crowd can lock onto, and Pinklon Thomas had 2, One you could see from the cheapest seat in the house, and one that could take your head off before you saw it coming. The first was the pink trunks. In a sport dominated by grim blacks and blood-serious reds, here was a heavyweight who stepped into the light wearing a color nobody else dared. It was bold. It was memorable. It said without a single word that this man was not afraid to stand out. The second identity was far more dangerous. It was his left jab. Not a flick, not a rangefinder, a genuine weapon. A punch thrown with such precision and authority that some analysts of the era placed it among the finest in the entire history of the heavyweight division, comparing it to the great jab of Sonny Liston himself. That is rare company. In a division built on the big right hand and the crushing hook, Thomas built his reputation on the most fundamental punch in boxing, thrown better than almost anyone alive. And the results piled up. By 1984, Pinklon Thomas carried a professional record of 24 wins, no losses, and a single draw. 24-0 with one draw. A resume like that, in the crowded and ferocious heavyweight landscape of the early 1980s, did not just earn respect, it demanded a shot at the world title. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most dangerous big men in the sport. But here is the contradiction beating quietly beneath all of it. As that gleaming record grew, as the wins stacked and the reputation swelled, so did the dependency he carried in secret. The man the public celebrated and the man behind closed doors were becoming two very different people. One was rising toward the summit of his sport. The other was still trapped by a battle that had begun on that awful day at 12 years old. The public saw only the champion in waiting. They had no idea what he was carrying with him. Right up to the night, the world title itself would finally be within his reach. The last day of August, 1984. Las Vegas, Nevada. The desert city where boxing writes so many of its biggest chapters. On this night, everything Pinklon Thomas had built over 6 unbeaten years came down to a single opponent standing across the ring, the reigning World Boxing Council heavyweight champion, Tim Witherspoon. They called him Terrible Tim, and the nickname was earned. He was fast for a big man, powerful, and dangerous in every exchange. What followed was not a highlight reel knockout. It was something harder, and in many ways more impressive. A grueling 12-round battle between two elite heavyweights, each trying to break the other's will. Round after round, Thomas leaned on the weapon that had carried him this far, that long, punishing left jab, snapping into the champion's face, controlling distance, setting the tempo of a war neither man wanted to lose. When the final bell rang and the decision was read, the belt changed hands. Pinklon Thomas, the boy from Pontiac, the teenager who had been lost before he ever laced up a glove, was the World Boxing Council heavyweight champion of the world. To appreciate what that meant, you have to remember the era. The mid-1980s heavyweight division was a fractured, ferociously crowded landscape. There was no single undisputed king holding every belt. Titles were split among sanctioning bodies, and a dozen hungry contenders circled at all times. To claim one of those crowns, you had to be genuinely, provably one of the best big men on the planet. Thomas was. And here is where the celebration curdles into something colder. Because while the crowd roared for a brand new champion at the peak of his powers, the truth, confirmed by Thomas himself years later, was that the dependency he carried had climbed into that ring right alongside him. It never left the corner. The most dangerous man in that arena that night was fighting two opponents. Only one of them wore gloves. 10 months later, he would defend that title with a single spectacular punch. But the deeper question was already whispering beneath the applause. How long can any man hold a crown while quietly fighting a war no one can see? A champion is only as good as the way he defends the belt. And when Pinklon Thomas made his first major title defense, he answered the question about his power in the most dramatic way imaginable. His opponent was Mike Weaver, a former heavyweight champion himself, a hard, experienced fighter who knew exactly what it took to wear the crown. This was no soft touch. Roughly 10 months after winning the title, Thomas stepped in against Weaver, and in the 8th round, ended the night with a single punch. Not a flurry, not an accumulation.
One clean, decisive blow that reminded the entire division there was crushing power hiding behind that technical jab. The man who was celebrated for the most fundamental punch in boxing had just shown everyone the finisher underneath. But step back from the highlight, and a much harder question comes into focus. How does a man do this? How does a human being train for a world title defense, endure the running, the sparring, the brutal discipline of a fighter's camp, while carrying a chemical dependency the whole time? By his own later admission, that is exactly what was happening. Thomas has said plainly that he was still in the grip of a forbidden substance through these very championship fights. Imagine the toll. Training for a heavyweight title bout demands a body pushed to its absolute limit. Now imagine doing it while a personal battle quietly drained your consistency, your health, your steadiness from the inside. It is a contradiction that almost defies belief, and yet the record shows he kept winning anyway, at least for a while. There was also the world he lived in. Being a black heavyweight champion in the 1980s came with its own crushing weight. There was money moving in every direction, powerful promoters holding the keys to a fighter's future, and the constant, unrelenting pressure of public expectation. And in that world, a champion could never show a crack. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was ruin in the marketplace of boxing. So the private battle stayed private, hidden behind the pink trunks and the confident smile. But no man carries that kind of weight forever. And in March of 1986, against an opponent who had already shared the ring with legends, the crown Thomas fought so hard to win finally began to slip from his grasp. Trevor Berbick was not a man to be taken lightly. He was a durable, awkward, hard-nosed heavyweight who had already stood across the ring from some of the biggest names the sport had ever produced. And in March of 1986, it was Berbick who would take the World Boxing Council Heavyweight Championship away from Pinklon Thomas, winning by decision over the full distance. There is no single knockout blow to point to here, no one dramatic moment. It was a decision loss, the kind that leaves a fighter staring at the scorecards, wondering where the rounds slipped away. And for a champion, that particular kind of defeat can cut deeper than any knockout. A knockout is sudden. A decision loss is slow. 12 rounds of feeling the crown loosen, minute by minute, until it is simply gone. For Thomas, this was the first great fall of his career, and it is impossible to look at it purely as a boxing result. Because the visible decline in that ring was shadowed by the invisible battle that had ridden alongside him through every single victory. For years, the dependency had hidden behind the belt, behind the wins, the defenses, the roar of the crowd. Now, there was no crown to hide it. The armor was gone, and the private war had nowhere left to disguise itself. A lesser man might have vanished at that point, slipped quietly out of contention, another former champion fading into the long list of names the sport forgets. But Pinklon Thomas did not vanish. Instead, he did something remarkable. He responded with 3 straight knockout wins, clawing his way back up through a brutal division, reminding everyone that the power and the skill were still very much there. Those 3 knockouts were not just comeback victories. They were a statement. They dragged him back toward the very summit of the sport, and they earned him a date with the most feared, most talked about name in all of boxing. A date that would define his legacy in the eyes of history. The 30th of May, 1987, against a 20-year-old force of nature who was rewriting what a heavyweight could be. By the spring of 1987, one name had swallowed the entire heavyweight division whole: Mike Tyson. 20 years old, unified champion, holding both the World Boxing Association and World Boxing Council titles, and demolishing grown men with a ferocity boxing had rarely seen. He was not just winning, he was frightening people. And on the 30th of May, 1987, Pinklon Thomas walked into that storm with both of those titles on the line. Now here is the detail that tells you everything about the character of the man. By some accounts, Thomas entered that fight carrying a serious shoulder injury, the kind of ailment that would give many fighters a reason to pull out, or at least an excuse to reach for later. Thomas offered no such excuse, and in the early rounds, something extraordinary happened. He did not merely survive against the young destroyer. He found real success, using that famous left jab to outbox Tyson, popping it into the champion's face, showing the whole boxing world that this phenomenon could, in fact, be hit and frustrated. For a while, the veteran was schooling the prodigy. Then came a strange interruption, a pause in the action for a torn glove, a break that let the young champion gather himself. And when the fight resumed, the tide turned with terrifying speed. In the 6th round, Tyson surged forward and unloaded a devastating combination, reported as a salvo of some 15 punches that finally did what no other man had ever managed. He put Pinklon Thomas on the canvas. Sit with the weight of that. In a career full of wars against dangerous heavyweights, Thomas had never once been knocked down, not by anyone. This was the first, and it would be the only knockdown of his entire professional life. To his enormous credit, he beat the count and got back to his feet. But the referee had seen enough, and the fight was waved off. It was a defeat, yes, but it was also, in a strange way, a display of the courage that defined him. He had gone into the deepest water in the sport, hurt, and made the most feared man in boxing work for it. And it has been reported that Tyson himself later spoke of Thomas with unusual respect. Yet respect does not pay the private debts a man carries. And after this fight, the second, quieter battle in Thomas's life was about to tighten its grip in ways the public could no longer ignore. Every fighter dreads the fall that comes after the biggest night. But for Pinklon Thomas, the danger after the Tyson fight was not in the ring at all. It was inside him. If the early battle had been with one forbidden substance, this new chapter belonged to another. A different personal demon now moved to the center of his life, and it began to pull him under in ways that could no longer be hidden behind training camps and championship belts. The discipline that had once carried him to a world title started to crack, and the man who had always found a way to show up began at times to simply disappear. The most telling sign came not in an arena, but at a dinner. Thomas was supposed to be an honored guest at a boxing event in Miami, the kind of appearance a former champion makes with ease, shaking hands, wearing the respect of the room. But he never made it in. By the reports of that period, he was too impaired to attend. Think about the quiet humiliation buried in that small detail. Not beaten by an opponent, not stopped by a referee, simply unable to walk into a room where he was meant to be celebrated. And this is where the whispers around his story grow darker. Some secondary accounts have suggested that in the destructive stretch following the Tyson defeat, Thomas came dangerously close to a fatal outcome, that a binge in those days nearly cost him his life entirely. Those specific claims are not confirmed by the most reliable reporting, so they must be treated with real caution. But even the cautious version is chilling enough. Reports suggested he came dangerously close to the edge in the days after that fight. What was verifiable was the trajectory. A champion's discipline unraveling. A man once defined by his iron will, now losing rounds of a fight that had no bell, no referee, no scorecard. Only consequences. The savings, the health, the reputation built over years of brutal work were all quietly draining away. He was still technically an active fighter. There were more nights ahead, more names to face. But the truth was that the most important fight of Pinklon Thomas's life was no longer being contested under the arena lights. It was happening in the dark hours no camera ever filmed. And it was about to bring him face to face with the one man who had believed in him, and the painful decision that man was about to make. By December of 1988, the man who had once controlled the tempo of world title fights had been away from the ring for a long, quiet stretch, a layoff of many months. And when he finally returned, the sport did not offer him a gentle path back. It handed him one of the most dangerous rising forces on the planet, a top contender named Evander Holyfield. Holyfield was hungry, sharp, and climbing fast toward greatness. Thomas, by contrast, was rusty, worn, and by some reports, carrying a serious health crisis in the period leading up to the fight. Those accounts are not fully confirmed, and they deserve caution. But whatever the exact condition of his body, the result told a hard story. Thomas looked like a shadow of the champion who had once out-jabbed Mike Tyson. He was outmatched, outworked, and the fight was stopped in the 7th round. For most fighters, a loss is just a loss. For Pinklon Thomas, this one triggered something far more painful than a defeat on the record. In his corner stood one of the most respected trainers who ever lived, Angelo Dundee. The same Dundee who had guided legends. The same Dundee who had prepared Thomas for both the Tyson fight and this Holyfield night. And Dundee had reached a breaking point. He could accept his fighter being beaten inside the ropes. That was the sport. What he could no longer accept was watching Thomas destroy himself outside them. So he made the hardest call a mentor can make. According to Thomas, Dundee cut him off completely, told him plainly that he wanted nothing more to do with him, that Thomas should forget his phone numbers entirely. Not out of cruelty, out of a grief so deep it had nowhere else to go. And in that moment, the man who had once worn a world championship belt found himself with nothing. No title, no trainer, no corner. Thomas would later describe the devastation in words that land like a punch to the chest. "I felt alone in the world," he said. That was the bottom. Discarded by the sport, abandoned by the man who had believed in him, and deep in the worst stretch of his life, Pinklon Thomas stood at a crossroads with only two roads left: the end of everything or the single decision that could save him. Some men hit bottom slowly. Pinklon Thomas hit it all at once, in the cold early hours of a stretch of days he could barely remember. Weeks after the Holyfield loss, around February of 1989, he fell into a destructive spiral that lasted for days. By his own account and the reporting of that period, he had lost significant weight and had all but stopped caring for himself for the better part of a week. The proud, powerful heavyweight who had once ruled a division was for those long hours a man who had nearly given up on his own life. And then, somewhere inside that darkness, something turned. There was no crowd for this moment, no referee, no ring, no title on the line. Just a broken man and a decision. In his own words, plain and unforgettable, Thomas would describe it like this: "That was it for me. I decided to become 100% clean." Now, here is the detail that gives this story its strange, aching beauty. The date he chose as his line in the sand was the 10th of February, his own birthday, the very same day he had been born 31 years earlier in that hard industrial town in Michigan. Think about the weight of that. A man who had been given a life on the 10th of February 1958 chose to reclaim that life on the 10th of February 1989. One birthday marked the day he entered the world. The other marked the day he decided to stay in it. Two beginnings, exactly 31 years apart. And he has honored that date ever since. Every year, when the 10th of February comes around, Thomas celebrates. Not just another year of age, but another year of freedom. In his own words, spoken without a trace of embarrassment, "There is no shame in my game." That is a remarkable thing for a proud fighter to say out loud. No hiding, no spin, just the plain truth of a man who had walked to the edge and turned back. But deciding to change and actually escaping are two very different fights. To truly get free, Thomas would have to walk through the doors of a treatment clinic and then break the grip of one of the most powerful men in all of boxing. A decision is only the first punch. The real work comes after, in the quiet, unglamorous places where no one is watching and there is no belt to win. For Pinklon Thomas, that work began in Detroit. According to reporting from the period, he entered treatment at a facility known as the Eastwood Clinic, taking the first concrete step toward a genuine recovery. This was not a press conference or a photo opportunity. It was a former world champion, stripped of everything that had once defined him, sitting down to fight the hardest opponent of his life in the least glamorous room imaginable. And slowly, it began to work. By 1989, the man who had been counted out by the sport, by his trainer, and very nearly by himself, was in recovery. The chemical chains that had been fastened to him since childhood, since that terrible door that opened at 12 years old, were finally beginning to loosen. But there was a second set of chains to break, and this one belonged to the business of boxing itself. For years, Thomas had been tied to the promotional empire of one of the most powerful figures the sport has ever known, Don King. And by late 1989 and into the early months of 1990, Thomas found himself legally free of that contract at last. It was a date he said he had circled on his own mental calendar, counting the days toward liberation. As one newspaper described it at the time, few fighters ever escaped that kind of grip easily. Thomas had. So there it was, a double liberation, Freedom from the substance that had haunted him since boyhood, and freedom from the contract that had bound his career. For the first time in a very long time, Pinklon Thomas belonged to himself. And yet the sport does not deal in clean fairy tales. There was a bitter irony waiting inside that freedom. If Thomas ever hoped to fight at the highest level again, to chase real money and real contenders, he might have had no choice but to do business once more with the very machine he had just escaped. That was the cruel arithmetic of boxing in that era. You could walk away from the powerful men who ran the sport, but the road back to the top often ran straight through them. Still, freedom is freedom. And clean, sober, and unbound for the first time in years, Thomas made a choice that surprised a great many people. He laced the gloves back on. Most fighters, having survived what Pinklon Thomas survived, would have walked away from the ring forever. He had already been to the mountaintop and back down into the darkness. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. But a fighter's heart does not always listen to reason. And so, from 1990 onward, Thomas returned to the only arena he had ever truly known. The comeback was not a triumphant march. It was a hard, uneven road, paved with both courage and cost. In February of 1991, he stepped in against a heavy-handed young heavyweight named Tommy Morrison. It did not go well. Thomas was cut and shaken up in the very first round, and the fight was stopped between rounds. It was the kind of night that tells a man the calendar has caught up with him, that the reflexes and the granite chin that once carried him through wars were no longer quite what they had been. And yet, he pressed on. In 1992, he mounted one more determined comeback stretch, stacking up wins and eventually outpointing an opponent named Craig Payne. For a man who had lost his title, his trainer, his savings, and very nearly his life, simply standing in a ring again, clean, upright, and still competing, was its own kind of victory. But every fighter meets the final bell. For Pinklon Thomas, it came in January of 1993. In what would be his last professional fight, he was upset by a journeyman known as Pancho Carter. And with that, the long and turbulent ring career of a former heavyweight champion of the world came quietly to a close. When the dust settled on all of it, the glory and the falls, the championship nights and the comeback attempts, the final ledger read 43 wins, 7 losses, and a single draw, with 34 of those victories coming by knockout. It is a record that speaks of genuine power and genuine skill. But numbers on a page never tell the whole story of a man. And Thomas's greatest fight had never been recorded on any scorecard. The ring was behind him now. What lay ahead would test whether a man could take the hardest lessons of his life and turn them into something that might save someone else. When the cheering fades and the lights of the arena go dark for good, a fighter is left with a simple, brutal question. What was it all for? For Pinklon Thomas, the answer did not lie in the belt he once held, or in the famous names he shared a ring with, or even in that punishing left jab that some once ranked among the finest the heavyweight division had ever seen. The answer lay in the very thing that had nearly destroyed him. Looking back on his life, Thomas came to understand something profound about all those wars under the lights. The toughest opponent he ever faced was not Tim Witherspoon, not Mike Weaver, not even the young destroyer who handed him the only knockdown of his career. In his own words, my toughest opponent was me, myself, because of the substance addiction. The hardest fight of his life had been the one no crowd ever cheered for, and he had won it. So he did what only the strongest survivors do. He turned his scars into a torch. Thomas founded an organization called Project P.I.N.K, Pride in Neighborhood Kids, and became a motivational speaker, carrying his story into schools and communities, standing in front of young people and telling them the unvarnished truth about the door that had opened for him at 12 years old. He never hid from any of it. He urged children to stay in school, to steer clear of the destructive habits that had nearly swallowed him whole, to set goals and chase them with everything they had. As he put it, the youth of today is our tomorrow. And he found a purpose in the telling that fame had never given him. "It makes me feel really good to share it," he said, "because I know it can help somebody else who might be in that position right now." He wanted them to know there was a way out because he had found one himself. He would also pour his story onto the page in a memoir carrying that unflinching title, Back from the Edge of Hell. The full arc laid bare, from the streets and the darkness to the championship and beyond. And in his later years, settled in Florida, he passed along the wisdom he had gathered from the great men of the sport to a new generation of fighters, offering guidance not only on boxing, but on the far harder business of surviving one's own demons. That is the true measure of Pinklon Thomas. Not simply that he was once heavyweight champion of the world, not simply that he stood across the ring from the most feared man in boxing and made him work, but that he stared into the abyss that had followed him since childhood, chose life on his own birthday, and then spent the rest of his days trying to hand that same choice to someone else. The belt eventually passed to other men. The records will one day be broken. But remarkable, remarkable story. But the story of a boy who lost himself before he ever found the ring, and found his way back when everyone, including himself, had nearly given up. That is a legacy no scorecard could ever hold. He came back from the edge, and then he turned around and reached for the hand of the next person standing there.